Okay, this is the video in which I talk about some points to ponder relative to Chapter 6. Now, in this brief video, I'm actually going to be talking about, let me double check here, 6 points to ponder. There's in fact a lot of material in this chapter, and I would encourage you to read it probably a couple of times and take fairly copious notes trying to really grasp everything that's being covered. There's an awful lot of material that you would find typically in a standalone strategic management course. So as you might imagine, it's really condensed and therefore lots for you to ponder. So, first point. This chapter is one of two that's focused on the management function of planning. And while planning is a function that is in fact undertaken at all levels of management, top management is the level which is primarily responsible for determining an organization's strategy. That includes its vision, its mission, its strategic goals and objectives. Other levels of management and people throughout the organization will often, not always, but often be involved in strategic and operational planning. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's top management that is responsible and should be held accountable for the organization's strategy. They're compelled, they need to think long term, and they also need to be thinking in the context of the triple bottom line. So that's the first point. Top management, those are the folks who really need to be thinking about strategy. Second point, I desperately want you to read the Porter and Kramer article that I posted on our D2L site. You'll find it under the Content tab, under Session 4. And the reason that I want you to read this article is that it is in fact a critical piece. It argues that responsible management is really smart management. It's what anybody who's really done their research and thought carefully about how they should or could run their organization, it reflects how they would do it. It also reflects a quote that you'll find on page 157 of our text, which says that there is an immense potential for the co-creation of business value complementing value for society and the environment. So there's nothing contradictory about the triple bottom line. There's no reason why we can't be thinking about our financial status along with how we're treating the people in our organization and in the communities in which our organizations exist and those that they serve, along, of course, with the environment, which is the source of our raw materials. It's often the home where we deposit our wastes, and it's the zone in which our organization operates. So these are they're not mutually exclusive, but rather they have the potential to complement each other, creating some synergistic opportunities that would otherwise be ignored. Okay, as noted on page 157, really the key question for you to be pondering as you read this chapter is, how can an organization, any organization, doesn't have to be a business, achieve a sustained competitive advantage and at the same time create value for society and the environment through the strategic management process? Okay, so that's the big question. Pretty straightforward. Well, it is, as long as you understand what the strategic management process entails. And there are 4 phases. So this is an iterative process. It's not a one-time deal. It's not, okay, we set our vision and our mission. We don't ever have to worry about those ever again. No, you're consistently cycling through this process. And it isn't even a matter of you do 1 and then you do 2 and then you do 3. Okay. It's not quite that simple. Your organization, you'll find yourself diving in at anywhere, somewhere in those 4 steps, those 4 phases, and then picking up the other phases. That is, if you're doing this correctly. Okay, so the first phase, and by the way, you can see this captured in Figure 6.1, which is on page 158. The first phase deals with articulating that vision, mission, and those strategic goals and objectives. The second phase is where we do our environmental analysis, or what we call our SWOT analysis. I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Then phase 3 is strategy formulation. This is where we're talking about for the overall organization, for its business units, and also for its functional areas. Finally, phase 4 is implementation and control. This is where we do what we said we're going to do, and then check to see if reality is really matching our plans. Okay, those are the first 2 points. Point 3 deals with section 6.2, starting on page 159. And while this is a relatively brief section, it is one that I think is incredibly important. And I want you to read it probably a couple of times and really reflect carefully upon it. So the authors talk about how the traditional definition of competitive advantage is anything that delivers above average returns to shareholders who are owners. Okay. From a responsible management perspective, obviously that is an insufficient definition. Instead, we are looking at above average returns that are not limited to profit and that don't necessarily accrue strictly to the organization's owners. Again, keeping in mind what we've discussed in prior chapters, there are other stakeholders who matter, and of course, we care about the triple bottom line, not just profit. We also care about people and the planet. Now, a question that I would ask you to think about, and one that I have not resolved to my satisfaction in my own mind, is this. How likely is it that an organization can achieve a sustainable above average return? My experience in the professional world, and certainly most of what I've read in the research literature, suggests that, generally speaking, when an organization achieves an above average return, it's only a matter of time before other organizations seek to mimic, to copy, to discover the source of that competitive advantage, and to replicate, perhaps even exceed the value of that particular competitive advantage, which at that point then the organization is not able to deliver above average returns based upon that one piece of the pie. Think, for example, of an organization that has a patent, perhaps a pharmaceutical patent. So for some time, while they own the patent, yes, they're making above average returns, but at a certain point, that will no longer be the case. And so what happens is you have this continuous drive to find the next best competitive advantage. Okay, well, so maybe that's one way to think about a sustainable organization. It's one that's always looking for the next best competitive advantage. But I can also see the potential for a tremendous amount of waste and issues accruing to the environment and so on that would be negative. And I'm not sure that that traditional way of thinking is ultimately the best way for us to think about how organizations function. For example, this doesn't allow us to think about a collaborative model of organizations. Now, not a colluding model of organizations that leads to something like price fixing, but certainly there's the potential for organizations to collaborate, at least on some level, with each other, perhaps across industries, that doesn't necessarily yield above average returns, but perhaps yields sufficient returns for the organization to continually satisfy and take care of its triple bottom line. Okay, so those are the first 3 points. Point 4 starts in section 6.3. This is on page 160 and going forward. And here it's a pretty basic lesson in strategic management terms. So you've got, first of all, vision. Vision is the big idea. It's, as an organization, ultimately, what do we think we should become, and what do we think we ultimately could achieve? A lot of people will talk about vision as something that we don't necessarily expect to accomplish within any reasonable time frame. It's what we'd really aspire to. Okay, so it's aspirational. The mission statement, on the other hand, is a little bit more in the now, excuse me, and a little bit more pragmatic, if you will. Its focus is, okay, what business are we in? What is it that we actually do? At this point in time, right now, what is it that we're doing? Who's in our market? Who are our customers? What is it that we make? What are the processes that we use to create and deliver the products and services that we call our own? What are our values? So I always say, with a mission statement, we're trying to answer 4 questions. First, who are we? Second, what do we do? Third, why do we do it? And finally, fourth, whom do we serve? And I think most mission statements, if they answer those 4 questions, they will help the organization to make decisions. Keep in mind, ultimately, that is our goal when we engage in strategic management. We are trying to enable our management, our folks, to make the best decisions for the organization based upon what it has said it's all about and where it wants to head. Okay? Objectives, goals and objectives are basically our to-do list. They're both the medium and the long term. So how are we going to move in the direction of that vision? How do we actually accomplish our mission? All right. So that's 4 points. Point 5 deals with section 6.4, and it starts on page 162. And here we're talking about this environmental analysis that I referenced earlier. And so we talk about a SWOT analysis. And SWOT is simply an acronym for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you have the internal analysis, which is strengths and weaknesses. What are we really good at? Potentially, what are we better at than anybody else? Second, what are we not so good at? Where do we think we need to shore up our capability? Where do we need to acquire additional resources, perhaps talent, in order to position ourselves better in the market space that we've decided to operate? Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind as I'm talking is this. I am not only talking about for-profit organizations. Not a chance. When I talk, now your text tends to talk about businesses, but when I'm talking, I'm saying organization. I am including for-profit, nonprofit, educational institutions, government agencies, the full gamut. If it's an organization, I'm talking about it. Okay? So the internal stuff, again, strengths and weaknesses. External opportunities, what's out there that maybe we could take advantage of? And second, what are the threats? So what potentially could damage our organization, keep us from being able to fulfill both our mission and our vision? Now, in this section, also, you will want to carefully review Porter's 5 forces. You'll see this on page 165. Figure 6.3 does a good job of capturing this visually. Porter's 5 forces are very important for you to be familiar with. We talk about the threat of new entrants. We talk about the bargaining power that both buyers and suppliers potentially hold sway. We talk about our competitors, and we talk about the threat of substitutes. So these 5 forces contribute to both opportunities for competitive advantage. So as an organization, we can look at, again, threat of new entrants. What do our buyers potentially hold over us? What do our suppliers potentially hold over us? What are our competitors doing? And every organization has competitors. Again, it doesn't matter if it's for-profit or otherwise. And then finally, the threat of substitutes. And again, even religious organizations are subject to these 5 forces. It's not at all limited to businesses. So again, opportunities for competitive advantage, but also these 5 forces contribute to environmental uncertainty. They can make life more challenging for us as we try to analyze that environment and then decide how to deal with those issues. All right, finally, point 6, section 6.5. This starts on page 169. Very quickly, you've got corporate level strategy. Here we're trying to decide in which markets should we compete. That's our horizontal integration. And then how many stages of the value chain should we do ourselves versus outsource? That's vertical integration. And we talk about we can diversify or we can divest, so we can add or we can subtract. And if we decide to add, do we add business units that look much like the business units we already have? And remember, when I say business units, it could be anything, okay? It's just a division. So do we want the same, that's related, or do we want different, that's unrelated? Then you've got business level strategy. So how do we manage within the unit? And here you've got, as it shows on page 172 in figure 6.8, you've got 4 options. You've got cost leadership, differentiation, cost focus, and differentiation focus. Read that material carefully because you're going to hear these terms and phrases a lot. And the examples that are provided in figure 6.8 I think are really good at illustrating the differences among these 4. Porter says, try not to get stuck in the middle. Other folks have argued, actually you can have it all. You can be a cost leader and you can differentiate. Now in this class, I'm going to ask you to consider the following. What is the price of low cost? In order to deliver a cost leadership strategy, like a Walmart does, who isn't getting paid very much? Who is perhaps no longer able to provide for their family? Which community is suffering because we are pressing for lower and lower costs, not always as a function of new technology, but often, shockingly often, let's just say it right out loud. We basically don't allow people to make a living wage, and that's how we achieve cost leadership. Is that a strategy that a sustainable and responsible organization tries to pursue? Or does it try to make itself aware of how that cost leadership is achieved? Something for you to ponder. The rest of the chapter I think is relatively straightforward, and I will leave you to read it, to ponder, and of course, if at any point you have questions, to talk to me about those questions. Thanks.